I guess the starting would be going back to my father, Fundador Cali Soriano, growing up in a constructive narrative. He was a writer, producer, and filmmaker in the Philippines. And growing up, there was already that idea of performative, this kind of fake reality, that one kind of construct. And as a kid, I remember when actors used to rehearse their lines at our place, I kind of started to reimagine narratives and stories or melodramas. So when I was born in 1980, they decided to put me as the baby prop for this TV show called Flor de Luna, which is a telenovela Filipino drama. And one of the actresses is Julius de Belen. If you're Filipino, you probably would know who she is. So I guess in a way, my starting is this kind of idea of performative or becoming an object to kind of re-represent. So at an earlier on, excavating all of these old photographs, I started to kind of question that idea of the narrative or the false narrative. So I grew up in the Philippines in 1980 to 1990. Growing up and not knowing what the word queer or gay is, I just knew that something was different. I remember approaching my brother at 5 years old, telling him that his friend, who's a guy, was attractive and I wanted to hold his hand. And then my brother continues and say, "Ew, that's sick, I'm gonna tell on mom." And at that point, as a young child, we were shown what's right and what's wrong. So to me, I realized that, maybe I should be acting a certain way. So again, all of these notions of narratives and performance and changing starts to really in-depth in self in my experience growing up. And I thought it was normal. Being gay was normal, or I didn't have the vocabulary of what gayness is, but I thought people are just meant to love who they want to love or care for or be attracted to. So at an earlier age, I was shown that there is an idea or a status quo, a way of living. And it was hard. It was hard to readjust. It was hard to live in a world where it felt like I was lost in. I remember for Christmas, I told my mom, she's here actually, sitting over there, I told my mom that I wanted a Barbie dream house.
What's going on here?
A housewarming.
Right. Now Mattel's famous Barbie has a brand new dream house.
But I got a remote control truck. And I was disappointed, but at the same time, I knew I had to do something about it because it wasn't the kind of toy I wanted. So I stole my mom's shoebox and plopped it on top of the remote control truck and cut out little flowers and stole my sister's Barbie doll and plopped it inside on top of and created my own parade. And I would call my family, look, it's a parade. This is before gay pride that I realized about that thing that happened. So at the earlier age, I realized the power of making or transforming things. And I realized, wait a minute, there's this idea of how the world say how people should live. Maybe I could alter it, change it. So I started to realize later on, maybe there is a certain power of art making and making a sense of belonging where I could feel like I belong. So I excavated this drawing in 1989. I was 8 years old, 7 years old. And growing up in the Philippines, we were getting a lot of westernized culture. So a lot of the things that I was drawing was Disney cartoons and tracing. And I guess that's what my introduction in art was, this westernized ideology of cartoon. And it didn't dawn on me later on, until later on when I've been looking at the artwork that I've been drawing as a kid, was they were all Western cues. If it's not Disney, it's G.I. Joe. If it's not G.I. Joe, it's She-Ra or Care Bears. And there was something missing. I was looking for a Filipino cartoon TV show that did not exist. But there was one called Panday.
The adventure continues this week in Ang Panday.
Which aired in 1986, which my father introduced to us growing up because he was one of the ghostwriter for that TV show, and it was actually the first Filipino TV show for children. So immigrating to Canada in 1990 was tough, and it was very changing for me. I was 9 years old, and I learned to assimilate, because if I didn't assimilate, I was the outcast. I was the other. I'd be the one that had no friends. I remember first time at school, and I was just standing at the portable during recess hours. I was that weird kid who just stands in the portable the entire recess hour, staring at people, and people staring at me. So I was slowly realizing the difference in cultural ideas. I couldn't bring in my Filipino food at school. Everyone was eating sandwiches. So my mom had to make sandwiches. I hate sandwiches, by the way. So I realized that we had to assimilate to feel like we belong. And not only that, but assimilate in the way we talk, the way we speak. And I remember my brother and my sister totally assimilated when they speak English, no accent whatsoever. I usually get made fun of because you can still hear a little bit of Filipino accent. And I was asking myself, why am I so frustrated to be ashamed of my Filipino accent? And I realized that maybe I shouldn't be ashamed of that, because maybe I shouldn't be ashamed that I have not completely whitewashed myself. So to me, all of those cues did not manifest until later on. High school was difficult, and a lot of the artwork that I was executing right away was very personal and very dark. This is an untitled ink on board between 1997 and 1998. And it was the time where I came out to a Catholic high school in Scarborough. So you guys know how that flies. I visited counselors all the time, and I was in a big depression. I was suicidal. I went to a point where, why would I exist in a world where there's no room for me? And to me, it was the darkest time where I started to realize maybe it's also a way for me to express those emotions through creating artwork. Dark artwork, but again, at least it's still artwork. And I brought my journal with me here, so I'm just gonna impromptu. I haven't really read a few of my journals in public before, so just bear with me. So I was looking through my old stuff, and I stumbled upon a journal that I wrote at that age. At the same time that I actually did this drawing. And it's just a little segment. And I said, but the memories is hard to get rid of. Like the times when some people in school would call me gay or faggot. But it's really embarrassing when they say it to me in the bus, as other people would stare at me and laugh. I had to get off the bus. But as one guy said, well, goodbye, faggot, just leave. And I did, and I walked the rest of the way home. And sometimes guys would just walk behind me and throw snowballs at me as I walked towards the bus stop. Luckily, they were really poor at aiming at stuff. Or high school students approaching me, asking me whether if I want to buy a gun to shoot myself. These are the kind of experiences that I had to go through. And these are only just a chip of what I had to battle, trying to exist in a world that has code-defying ideas of how people should be or live. So again, going back to the whole idea of narratives and performance and changing yourself, there's this idea of performance to survive. This is a photo of me, by the way, in high school. I have to pretend I'm like a thug, straight kid, so no one would bother me. So there was this idea of performing to survive, to just not be harassed, not be endangered. I was scared for my life. So I realized I had to live as someone else in order to just survive. But that stopped, and I gained the courage to just surrounding myself with friends and trying to figure out and trying to fight it. So, and my name used to be Franklin. So from, I know, Franklin Julius. So from Franklin to Julius. And after high school, I returned back home to the Philippines. That was in 2004. And it's an odd experience because, again, when I grew up most of the time in Toronto and have assimilated myself and learned and acquired how to be or what to be, and I got this word called diasporic queer Pygmalion complex, which I think I was kind of suffering through. So there's this idea where when I returned home, nothing seems familiar. When I returned home, there's an essence of a part of me being estranged from the place where I grew up and I was born. And to me, it was an odd feeling. And I started to realize this idea of not owning any idea of belonging to a land. And I started to realize the land belonging to us, we don't own the land. And maybe it's this idea that belonging somewhere is just an imaginary belonging where it doesn't exist. It's not a tangible space, it's in the mind. And that's what I started to create my work in, to create this idea of sense of belonging, of what has been erased or rechanged or transformed. This one, I just love this photograph of the pineapple fields in the Philippines in 2004, and the neighbors in Manila. And to me, I knew I should feel like I was home, but I felt like I didn't feel home anymore. But at the same time, I don't feel quite at home in Canada, or I don't see myself as truly Canadian. So a lot of my work is really trying to excavate that there is no such thing as us linking towards a sense of belonging. And to me, I had to grasp that idea that maybe this new hybridized space exists only within thoughts and within the artwork itself. So I decided to go to OCAD and study BFA and learn all of the traditional academic classical skills and practices. And I was so hungry to just become a camera, to just reduplicate a figure, an image as realistic as possible, because that's what the classical skills should be or ought to be. I wasn't really paying attention what I was drawing or whom I was drawing or what I was drawing, as long as I was drawing something quite realistic. And here's another one for pencil crayon on blackboard. And there's something that happens that I realized looking back at all of my work, is that most of it are men, are white, homonormative men. And some of them are images of my boyfriends that I've dated. So stashed away, I have collections of all ex-boyfriends that I've ever dated, drawing. I haven't gotten the guts to make a show about the ex-boyfriends. So I started to think why I was painting, why I was drawing, and what I was drawing. So I decided to back off on drawing and painting and really look closely at what is affecting me and think about it in a much more conceptual idea of how to create something else. So learning the idea of homonormative standards, growing up as a teenager, all of this ads that shows this ultra masculine, queer, white bodies or whitewashed bodies, or if it's another culture, it's exoticized. So I started to kind of look closely about that idea of sense of belonging or unbelonging or displacement, and looking back towards my own cultural history. And I was looking a lot about tribal Filipino tattooing. I kind of find it funny how one of the guy there looks like Bruno Mars over there. So I was thinking about the intricate of the identity of crafting, of a body mark making, and that idea of exchange of places within the tribe. And at that point, I got married and I lived in Paris, France for a year. And all the materials that I had was just a bunch of gay magazines. So I started to challenge myself to do a cutout or a drawn image every single day, to the point I had hundreds of them. And I started to think of creating artwork that is compact, that can travel with me when I return. So I started to do a series of cutting out images and really questioning this idea of the male body, of what is held up as perfection. So I started to question it. Why am I killing myself to look like this, or to want someone who looks like this? And a lot of those questions arise from excavating drawn lines, using negative space, and using colonial images as well. And then I started to use this idea of hybridizing those images of colonial aesthetics, European aesthetics, and yet having to execute it within all of these forms. And it kind of reminded me again, that idea of tattooing the body, excavating the negative space to create a notion of hybridized images. And I started to play around on what would happen if it actually started to come out of the wall. So a lot of the pieces starts to kind of resemble this very Gothic, Eurocentric, religious iconographies. And it reminded me of the sacred and the profane, and how we put things in a pedestal. And I was talking about it in a way of queer belongings or queer migrant belongings, and how we became invisible or exoticized within mainstream. And I was, as you notice, I'm slowly kind of going through the ideas of religion here. And I'm always trying to think back through my childhood experiences. And I remember I hate going to Sunday Mass as a child in the Philippines, because I had no concept why we have to go to this church. It's beautiful, but there's a dead man that's bleeding on a piece of wood. And to me, it was, as a child, I didn't know the concept. I was like, people sit here and they stare at the dead corpse, and I was just in fear. And it didn't help, there was like bats flying around. And so I was just questioning myself, why are we doing this? Is this kind of ritual that seems strange to me as a child, and questioning it. And then later on, realizing the idea of people's belief system. I do have respect for people's belief system. But for my belief system, I would probably feel closer to any kind of form of higher power, being closer to nature, rather than trapped inside a colonial chapel or church. So I started to create this work that was projected in 1 Spadina Crescent at U of T, and it's a life-size crucifix. And I was really playing around this ideology of the hybridized religion and gods. And if you look closely, there's actually little intricate symbols of this idea of capitalism, of the idea of what do people sometimes feel like they uphold, right? This materiality of things. There's a Mac symbol there, there's Louis Vuitton, McDonald's, Chanel. So I started to play along this idea and started to construct the flesh like a sculpture with fairies bursting out of the crucifix. And here's a detail of it. And none of my work do last. And I don't do work specifically for the idea of preservation. I allow my work to kind of just self-destruct afterwards, because I think that there's something great about that idea of a work that is inhabiting a time and space that will inevitably disappear. But we're talking about how to archive it. It's archived. People from photographs, from Instagram, from recordings. So to me, that was fascinating. And it was fascinating to know if I'm dealing with something that talks about loss and erasure, I better create work that I allow to be erased or not last for a long time and let it decay. There was this, I want to talk about this idea of land reclaiming itself in the Philippines. So when the Spaniards colonized the Philippines, they built this chapel near the Mayon volcano. And what happened was the volcano erupted and basically claimed and covered up the church to the point where all you see is the actual tower itself. And to me, this symbolized an idea of how no matter how much colonization tried to take over a country, a land, and claiming it to be theirs, somehow, sometimes the land will try and reclaim its own self. And I love this idea and this story. So I started crafting altars about it and using books and this academic books and really questioning what's inside this text in these books and creating a shrine for it. And what I've done is I started to excavate the texts, where in some of the texts I would just leave gay narrative innuendos, even though it's like a book about research on some philosophical idea. I started to rewrite things, and I saw the power of picking and choosing and recrafting, recreating and changing and transforming the materials that I was using. So I started to think about negative space as body in the Shooting Blank series, where I would cut out the figures that I really questioned, and really talking about the absence of the figure and me looking at the figure, looking at what I need to be looking at to be transformed into. So I started to really excavate this ideal notion of what if I took out the figure completely, the figures that has been represented into this realm of queer identity, where everything, this is the homonormative queer bodies. These are the ideas that is circulated still. And if it's another culture, it would be exoticized. So I still find it hard to kind of like this notion of fitting in and completely rearranging myself. And I feel like I have to constantly rearrange myself and change myself as years goes by, where I completely would turn into a different person. And all of these images that bombards us. I just started, every single time I see a male figure, I would just cut it out. I would cut it out, I would dispose of it, and I would just display this series of blank figures, which then excavated to an idea about the Shooting Blank series, where I went back to my history books and chose classical paintings of the male figures and recontextualizing them and placing them in very contemporary settings, in a way kind of queering up history. So in the next slide, we were talking about the homonormative, the medium culture. So growing up, I'm watching all of this TV show like Queer as Folk, Dante's Cove, Mambo Italiano, Will and Grace, and I wasn't seeing myself. I wasn't seeing an Asian gay character growing up. And it was difficult. It was difficult to belong, because these are the visions of ideal acceptance within queer confines. And I was a bit pissed off and lost, so I signed up for background performing, and I inserted myself in Queer as Folk. It was the only way for me to see myself in a TV show that did not represent myself. So, in a way, you see how that kind of looped as a baby in the melodramatic child concept? So again, there's this idea of performance and performative. So I really excavated a lot more about this idea and expanded it more towards an idea of how queer couplings or relationship or marriage, right? Gay marriage, gay rights. If you have the rights to get married, you also have the rights to get divorced, which I realized. So one of that piece was in this book, Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas. And the segment is called A Country That Does Not Exist, the Queer Decolonial Aesthetic of Myself. And what I did was, it was a project that I did at UTAC, where I asked them if can I get the biggest space in the gallery? And they were asking why. And I said, I wanted to transform it into a house, like a dollhouse. like the dollhouse that I wanted and never got. So now I can make it really big and accumulating a gallery. So I started to play around this idea of family structures, of queer fathers adopting, or want this need of having their own child. So I got this idea of maybe I needed to somehow craft this idea of belonging of the family. And this was a time where I actually just got married. And to craft the entire house, I used the balikbayan box. Now, the balikbayan box is actually a box that most diasporic Filipino use to put items to return back home. Balik means return, bayan means country. And to me, this box really symbolizes that idea of cultural appropriation or cultural exchange. Because a lot of the products that goes inside this box is a lot of westernized products. So I started to play around with the notion of wallpaper. So I started to create wallpapers that have hidden text in it, such as Rice Queen, Fudge Packer, Twink, a lot of the hurtful words that I hear growing up. And I created a pattern that then it's used with the actual documents of my marriage license. So the entire house, everything, all the furniture was crafted from this box, my marriage license, and this idea of what it is, this idea of crafting a family, a crest, a symbol, which pervade within this idea, notion of status within family. So I started to think about implementing a fictional child. So I started to build as well a fictional child's bedroom, and I started to excavate my childhood photos and the photos of my husband at that time, and crafted this fictional child named Christian James that can only exist. If it's going to be 50% myself, 50% him, it's going to be fictional, and it's going to be an edited digital child that only exists in this non-tangible way. So a lot of my themes too, it's trying to manifest things that are not tangible and questioning them. So I try my best to give him life. So I decided to give him his own Facebook account. And the moment we divorced after 6 years, he passed away, so the Facebook stopped. And I started to delve upon a new wallpaper series called the Divorce Wallpaper. So here I use the divorce documentation, and the silhouettes were selfie. So I was thinking about that idea of being alone and being by myself, and recontextualizing the queer words that says faggot and queer, and actually use the text badeng or bakla, which means gay and faggot in Tagalog, in Filipino. So I showed the two pieces at John B. Aird Gallery, like this, a wallpaper of darkness and lightness. I don't know why, it just happened that way, where being alone is lightness and being married is darkness. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. And I wanted to kind of show this because I wanted to kind of talk about that whole idea of fitting in. We all want to kind of, this idea of constructs of what family is, or we have to get married, or we have to build this kind of place or house of growing up. And then I started to move towards whitewashing products. So I grew up with all of this whitewashing products, with lotions and toners that would make our skin white. As a child, we always have to not stay in the sun for too long, a lot of the soaps, and they all still exist, all of this whitening products. And it really, it's hard because to me, I'm still in the process of that whitewashing idea, where my friends would say, Julius, why are you putting on colored contacts? Why don't you just wear your glasses? And to me, it becomes so like a habit. Oh, I'm gonna put a toner on that makes my skin white. It became as mundane as brushing my teeth because I grew up doing it as a child. So I started to get all of these gay magazines and talked about this idea of reverse whitewashing, where I would start to, with ballpoint pen, I would start to draw Asian features on top of them, and I would leave them by the window and let the sun bleach out the color until all you see is basically just the Asian feature. And then I did a series of them. So when I excavate an idea, I always like that idea of having different series. And again, the homonormative expectation within the dating scenes, right? This idea of being valued. There's an idea in queer community that you have to look a certain way, you have to act a certain way, you have to speak a certain way in order for you to be valued or loved, and to me it was shocking that that idea of constant displacement that still is occurring. So, and there's a few dating ads that I was just laughing at because a lot of the ads would say, let's keep it white or Latin, thanks, or things like no Asian please, or don't be gay, or straight acting. So there's this ideology of homonormative representation that's still predominant within queer culture. And this undertone of racism that happens within queer culture that most people would just kind of, oh, that's fine, it's okay, but it's not fine because it's hurtful and it makes me feel, or other BIPOC queer migrants feel, that they don't deserve love, they don't deserve to be part of a community. So I struggle a lot with those ideas of notion. So I started to also play with animation, and going back about growing up seeing Disney cartoons, I crafted this idea of kissing utopia goodbye, where I put myself as Snow White, and no matter how much the prince kisses me, I stayed dead, basically. I would never wake up. It's this kind of falsified idea of happy endings. The happy endings that never manifest. So this was painstakingly crafted one by one through Photoshop, and then looped and played. So going back to the next idea of this book, Diasporic Intimacies, where I talked about mainly Queertopia as a country that does not exist. So I was almost kind of extrapolating all of my ideas into one and trying to create a language of this idea of a country. What's with a country? How people become patriotic and so connected to certain countries. But at the same time, myself, I don't see myself connected to any country. And so I end up crafting my own imaginary place through my art, through my work, and through my research. And I started to do a show called Cabinet of Curiosities, this idea of taxonomy, this idea of looking at the body, this homonormative body, and reconstructing them and changing them. And these are butterflies that I researched, that are specifically indigenous to the Philippines. So here I am excavating these homonormative bodies and retransforming them into in flight and change. And this is one of the show. There was 2 vitrines, and there was 2 mannequin dolls that is wearing this hybridized costume. And the costume is basically a hybridized costume of indigenous tribes from the Philippines, and the Barong Tagalog and the Mestiza dress that is hybridized. And the Barong Tagalog and the Mestiza dress are actually clothing that the Spaniards presented to in the Philippines to clothe the barbarians, the tribes, put some clothes on them. So to me, it was crucial to me to kind of like really contextualize, and even though it symbolizes what it is to be Filipino, it's still a symbol of suppression and colonization. So I started to craft them into this hybridized form. So I would start to do the sketch of how I'm gonna combine all of the ideas together, and then the costume would just start to manifest. I really wanted to use like a Filipino mannequin, but it was so hard to look for those because it was mainly white masculine mannequins that's available. So I realized that I have to use what is available, what is given to me. So I just allow that to happen. And if you notice, a lot of this was shown again the window gallery at YYZ in 2018 in the context after crafting the intangible belongings. The stuff about my work is it never stays in one place. There's this idea of creating an artwork and the artwork having a home, where the idea of a lost artwork that has no place, has no country, has no home, has no space, has no permanency. And I love that notion of an artwork can exist in one space of a gallery and then would migrate and can exist to another space and can exist to another space. And I was really questioning that idea of the actual piece itself being diasporic, migrating. And that in itself is a performative. That itself is also part of the work. Because most of the time we think of artwork as this finalized things within the context of, the white cube, right? We tend to forget what happens to the lives of those art afterwards. So I tend to show my work again and again. They would self-destruct, I would craft them again, and I would show them to another place, to another place, to another place. And it was that idea of change and migration. I love that idea of migration. And here are the templates from the real butterflies to the left. And then I started to use homonormative as this idea of diasporic and inserting myself within the images repeatedly and creating this decorative designs where questioning how I fit in rather than using only appropriated images of male figures. I wanted to create how I could appropriate myself within these figures. And I started using Ken dolls as well, and intricate cutouts of text. And here's an installation of the animation of the butterflies in flight. And there's this hybrid rice queen that I crafted, that I performed with Catherine McTavish at the AGO in 2017, while she's reading something in Sanskrit and doing gestures of performative. There was something surreal being consumed inside this paper and covering myself with all of these ideas of what I ought to be, bits and pieces of body parts that everyone needs to attain for or questioning. It's like an armor where it completely obliterates me, but yet at the same time, I was still in control inside the costume. So I started to do large-scale photograph images as well. And I started to kind of fantasize the idea of the balikbayan and other cues within Filipino culture, like the cockfight, which I thought was very, very harsh to watch. This idea of masculinity, this idea of fighting to the death, this idea of brutality, of service, almost survival. So I used the queer images and retransformed them into this piece called Whitewashed Cockfight, which was shown at A Space Gallery, John B. Aird Gallery, and the Small Arms Gallery. So again, the artwork has this kind of migration idea of moving from one space to one space. And these are a few details. And I started to really incorporate cues of the actual whitewashing product. There's a skin whitening soap, there's the Eskinol skin whitening toner, and this nose that's supposed to make your nose pointy and less Asian. So a lot of these things that kind of helps one to kind of continually whitewash themselves. I started to use and place in the cloche right beside the intricate feathers of this homonormative representations of the bodies and faces. And these are some of the products. And I use some of these products, unfortunately. And these are the feathers and the products itself. And talking about that idea of migration and movement, we did this group show effort where we created Bahay Kubo at the Daniel Spectrum, and we had a lot of people help us build it. And what we did is it dwells in one space and we move it and migrate it to another space. There's this idea of nomadic idea of living into these huts, and what it is indigenous Filipinos would live into these huts and takes resources within the land, and once the resources in that land gets depleted, they would move out and let the land heal itself so they don't overtake too much. And that's that ideal notion of moving from one place to one place. And there's this idea, we're always constantly thinking about this idea of, oh, the permanent home or the place, or, but yet, what about that idea of displacement, of moving from one place to one place? And I like this image because it's contrast with all of these buildings behind, with the constructions and some of the condos that are building. And I love that kind of juxtaposition between something that is so permanent and yet a performative piece that really talks about that idea of change and moving and migration, which leads me to the work, the Balikbayan Bakla Maya, which means go back to your country, queer bird, where 69 birds flies outside of the Balikbayan box and try to go inside this whitewash cage. And I was really thinking about that idea of migration, but that migration somehow also could encage us and kind of transform us and make us kind of become a different person. And each of these birds, I actually also use my fingernail clippings, something that's indexical, something that talks about time, something that scratches to the surface. And let me just show a bit of this. So this is it in and with all of this, my last thing that I wanted to talk about is the work in progress, is excavating my family history that has been erased, that I could not find. This is Juana Calma and Emilio Diago family, and Solemnidad Hirano Cali and Clemente Cleo Soriano family. And these are family histories that stem from my father, who passed away just 4 years ago. So to excavate all of this historical stuff is difficult and has been difficult. And my mom's been helping me to correlate with relatives in the Philippines to excavate more of the family histories. And we found that Maria Josefa Gabriela Carino de Silang as one of my great aunt who never got married, who was the first anti-colonial fighter in the Philippines and lived 1731 to 1763. She was the first female revolutionary leader for a movement for independence from Spain. So excavating this and talking about my practice and talking about where I'm coming from, it's all starting to fit in together. And that's because I needed to find out my history. I needed to excavate a country of belonging that I do not exist in, a country of that has been erased. And I guess that's how I'm gonna end my talk and just play this at the back. So in a way, this is just one of the video format. In a way, I would like to end the talk that it's from the beginning to the end, it has been a struggle, but my saving idea, my saving constant thing that saves me was art, was creating, because through that, I can belong somewhere, I can be heard, and it's not such a dark place. Thank you.
ilang beses na ba akong ibahin at aking sarili? Parang maging mestizo ako o puti para lang magustuhan mo ko at mahalin mo ko. Sa pagtingin mo sa akin, hindi ba ako pwedeng mahalin? Para bang hindi ko makita na ako ay pwedeng mahalin? Itong bagay na pagmahalin para sa makuha, bakit ba akong balik ng balik sa'yo?
Samotność jest najtrudniej wytłumaczyć. Masz wrażenie, że kroczysz w głębokich ciemnościach. Albo jakbyś był w tłumie ludzi. Krzyczysz, ale nikt cię nie słyszy. Uciekałem przed tym przez ostatnią dekadę. W końcu, gdy się zakochasz i odnajdziesz swojego pierwszego mężczyznę, dochodzisz do wniosku, że miłość jest największą ludzką słabością.
Paano mo ba ako nakikita sa balat ko? Ilang maskara pa ba na dapat kong gamitin para lang pwede na ako sa inyo? Ano na ba? Nakakadiri ba ako? Para ba akong mapangit sa mata mo?
What more? Oh. What is it? No! Asshole! Fuck! Are you crazy? Crazy? For God's sakes! Get your shit together!
Jesteś gotowy poświęcić wszystko i pogodzić się ze wszystkim, co złe i co dobre. W końcu zauważasz, że zawsze byłeś samotny i miałeś tego dosyć. Nie masz zamiaru sięgnąć tego samego dna po raz kolejny. Zaczynasz się martwić, czy jestem wystarczająco dobry, wystarczająco atrakcyjny. Co będzie, jeśli on mnie zostawi?
Pag palagi ko nang iniisip na mas matinding aking damdamin, na baliwalaan na lang kita para sa ibang lalaki. Hindi ko maiisip na aking nararamdaman ay hindi ko na kaya. Meron akong gustong itanong sa'yo na naiistorbo ko na maraming beses. Nagsisinungaling ka ba sa akin? Nung gabi na hindi kita nakita at pinuntahan mo ba yung nakita ng mga lalaki mo na noon pa, yung dinedate mo, kahit na ginagawa mo, parang hindi kita maniwala sa sinasabi mo. Yun ba yung totoo? Para bang pinibigyan mo lang ako ng sinungaling at nasasabihin mo lang sa akin na iba't ibang storya. Yung pagkakamidi ko ay kinalabasan ng mga iba't ibang tao na pinapalis ako. Huwag mo na akong sisihin na ganito na ako. Huwag mo na akong ibahin. Ganito na talaga ako. Para bang hindi mo na akong intindihan sa puso mo na ganito na lang ako.
supposed to be like that. How are we supposed to be like you, right?
This is what is happening here. Bloopers!
Oh no, you're gonna make me fart. Let me just fart. Ah, fart. I just farted. Yeah. Ah!
On the telly.
No. It's sweet. Yours, taste it. It's butter. It's sweet and it's alcohol.
Out of your shell.
Da, 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 da.